Night falls softly over the world. Cities dim one by one. Windows close. The last lights in the hills fade to whispers. And then there is only the hush. A stillness so deep it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. In that silence, there is something ancient. Something that has waited longer than any star. It is not peace. It is the quiet sound of forgetting. Before words, before memory, before names, there was this, the black expanse of nothing remembered. Generations came and went, their voices carried away by wind and time. A man could carve his story into bark, sing his victories to the fire. But when he was gone, the silence would close again, smooth and endless, as if he had never been. This is what early humans feared more than death, not the ending of life, but the vanishing of meaning. They began to sense that the world itself was fragile, not because it could break, but because it could be forgotten. Every civilization begins with a tremor in the dark, a whisper that says, remember. Not for pride, not for vanity, but for survival. Because memory is the only way the dead can speak, and the only way the living can last. They built rituals, songs, paintings on cave walls, each a plea against the black tide of forgetting. To remember was to fight extinction. To name something was to keep it alive. So the first artist painted hands on stone, pressing red dust against cold walls. Not to say I am here, but let me not disappear. Those handprints were the first libraries. Then came words, shapes of sound, small and trembling, but enough to hold a thought in place. The first storytellers spoke beside the fire, their faces flickering like the flames themselves. They told of floods and spirits, of hunters and the stars that guided them. Each story was a vessel, each listener, a bridge. Memory passed from one mind to another, like an ember carried through the night. They did not yet write, but they understood the weight of remembering, and that knowledge once shared was no longer mortal. It could live where no flesh could follow. The night was not always kind. It erased as easily as it preserved. A single lost generation and songs vanished. Languages withered. Histories turned to dust. Somewhere in that endless cycle of remembering and loss, humanity made a vow. Never again. Never again would memory rely on fragile tongues and fading hearts. They would give thought a body, something it could live in. They would build vessels for time. And from that vow, civilization began. No one knows when the first flame of knowledge was lit. Perhaps it began with a mark in clay or a sign carved into stone. Perhaps it began when one person looked at another and said, write this down. Whatever the moment, it was the first time light challenged darkness. The first time humanity said, we will not vanish. That spark grew into something greater, a hunger, a need to preserve not just life, but thought. And so as night returned each day, a new kind of fire began to burn, one made not of heat, but of memory. Every era had its keepers, those who could not bear to let silence win. A scribe pressing symbols into clay, a monk copying a text by candlelight, a scholar translating the stars, a teacher whispering truth to a child. Different faces, different ages, but one shared duty, to keep the light alive. Sometimes they did not even know why they did it. They simply felt the pull, as if memory itself had chosen them. And in this way, generation after generation, the world began to weave its own immortality. Yet forgetting never vanished completely. It still walks beside us, soft-footed, patient, waiting for the lamps to fade. Empires crumble, books decay, languages die, and still, somewhere, a flame flickers in the dark. Because every time we remember, we rebuild what was lost. Every time we write, we strike another spark against the void. That is what makes us human. Not our strength, not our reason, but our refusal to let the night have the last word. And so it continues. Each age inherits the silence and the tools to fight it. Clay, papyrus, ink, light, each one a different language of defiance, each one a promise to the future. We may not know the names of those who kept the flame, but we live inside their work. We are their library. Every word we read, every memory we hold, is a rescue, a small salvation from the night of forgetting. And yet, not every flame survived. Some burned too brightly, too soon. Let us begin with the first, the Library of Alexandria, where humanity tried for the first time to remember everything. The flame of thought, night again. But this time the darkness feels different. It is not empty. It hums softly, alive with something invisible. Thought. Somewhere a hand moves, a voice murmurs to itself. A pattern forms. In clay, in twine, in air. The mind has discovered its fire. At first, thought was only instinct, a spark without language, a shimmer of awareness that came and went like breath. But then came reflection, the quiet miracle of a mind turning inward, seeing itself for the first time. It is one of the strangest things in all of existence, that the universe learned to look at itself through us. A hunter looks into the river and recognizes his own eyes. He begins to wonder, who am I? And with that question, a new kind of fire begins to burn, a fire that no wind can touch. The more humans thought, the more they gathered around that flame. Fire became more than warmth. It became symbol. It became story. Around the campfire, voices rose, each word an ember, each listener a guardian. They told of laws and beasts, of stars that listened and rivers that remembered. In those stories, they began to understand themselves. The flame was no longer just light. It was the reflection of the mind, the mirror of imagination. To sit before it was to stare into the soul of humanity itself. Somewhere along that ancient line of storytellers, there appeared another figure, one who did not just tell stories, but asked defying. Why does the sun rise? Why do the stars move? Why does the heart ache? The first philosophers were born not in cities, but in shadows. They watched fire and understood that it devoured to live, just as thought consumes ignorance to grow. To ask a question was an act of faith, to answer it, an act of rebellion. For every age, the teacher and the flame were the same thing, a light carried through the dark, fragile and bright. Soon the fire turned to sound. Language at first was only breath, a vibration between living bodies. But breath became syllable, and syllable became sign. The word was born. It moved like fire across the human world, from one tribe to another, from one shore to the next. Each new tongue carried its own rhythm, its own truth. And through those rhythms, people began to build invisible worlds, realms of story, law, and prayer. The word became a home for memory, and wherever words gathered, a civilization began. But there is a difference between speaking a thought and keeping it. When the world grew large and memory grew heavy, people needed a way to carry their thoughts across time. And so the first keepers appeared, scribes, carvers, dreamers. They took the fire from the voice and placed it into something solid. Symbols on clay, paint on walls, lines etched in bone. They were the first to understand that thought could live longer than flesh, that knowledge could outlast its maker. They became the secret architects of humanity, those who wrote not for fame, but for survival. Every age has known them, though few remember their names. And to write, to draw, to mark, these were the first forms of alchemy. For in each act of recording, the invisible became visible. Air became matter. Idea became artifact. It was the first miracle of civilization, the transformation of thought into permanence. The reed and the brush, the chisel and the stylus. These were our first wands, and every mark they made was a spell against oblivion. The world had learned how to make its own soul tangible. Knowledge multiplied, people began to hoard it, not from greed, but from reverence. They stored stories in baskets, laws in jars, maps on hides. They built small rooms to protect what could not protect itself. And slowly the first libraries emerged. Not yet marble halls, but huts filled with clay and parchment, guarded by silence and dust. Inside them, each word slept, waiting for the next generation to wake it. To walk into one was to enter a dream made of time. But knowledge, once born, cannot stay still. It spreads like fire, through trade, through conquest, through longing. Caravans carried tablets across deserts. Sailors brought scrolls across seas. Pilgrims whispered verses to one another under moonlight. And so the fire of thought began to travel, from one civilization to the next, passing through hands, hearts, and empires. Each age added to it, changed it, protected it. Every generation became both the heir and the guardian of the same light. But the flame is not gentle. It burns as it enlightens. For every truth uncovered, something is lost. For every book preserved, another is destroyed. Knowledge demands sacrifice, time, devotion, sometimes even life. Those who carried it through history often did so at great cost. And yet they carried it still, because they knew that to let it die would be to let themselves vanish with it. To remember was to live forever. And so it continued, century after century, name after forgotten name. The fire of thought still moves, shifting from hand to hand, changing its shape but never its purpose. It burned in the reeds of Mesopotamia. It glowed in the papyrus of Egypt. It flickered in the lamps of Cordoba. It hums now in circuits of light and code. Always the same, always alive. The flame of thought, the one fire that never sleeps. But every flame needs a vessel, every idea needs a home. And so the builders came, the ones who gave memory its first walls and windows. The builders of memory. There comes a moment in every civilization when thought becomes too heavy for the wind. Stories grow vast, laws multiply, dreams expand beyond the reach of the tongue. And so humanity does what it always does when something becomes sacred. It builds a temple. Not of stone alone, but of silence and care in the desperate need to make the invisible endure. These were the first libraries, the houses of thought, the shelters of eternity. The first libraries were not made for beauty. They were built to protect. Small, windowless rooms filled with clay, their walls cool and dry, their air thick with dust and devotion. Each shelf carried hundreds of tablets, each tablet a voice from the past. Together they formed something greater, a chorus of memory. To enter one was to hear that chorus singing softly in the silence between words. Here, time itself was stored, stacked, labeled, cataloged, like a substance that could be measured. And in a way, it could. Every tablet, every scroll, was a small portion of immortality. To guard these places, there were always a few, men and women who lived among words, half scholars, half priests. They woke before dawn, lit the lamps, and began the endless work of copying. Theirs was a sacred monotony, line after line, symbol after symbol, their breath syncing with the rhythm of the stylus. Some worked a lifetime on a single book. Others died before their work was done, leaving behind fragments for another hand to finish. But none of it was in vain. Every letter written was a bridge across centuries. Every book completed was another victory against the dark. The scribes did not build monuments. They built continuity. From simple huts, the idea grew. As empires rose, so too did their temples of memory. In Mesopotamia, archives of clay. In Egypt, houses of papyrus and gold. In Greece, libraries joined to temples. In Rome, marble halls filled with scrolls. Each generation built upon the last, each structure an echo of those before. A new kind of architecture was born, one designed not to impress the gods, but to preserve the thoughts of men. And yet, there was something divine in that purpose. To build a library was to imitate creation itself, to bring order from chaos, light from darkness, memory from silence. For ancient builders, a library was not just a storage room. It was a universe in miniature. The walls were the skin, the scrolls the stars, and each text a constellation, a fixed point in the map of knowledge. To walk inside one was to move through time itself, past lives and civilizations, each shelf another century. Even the act of reading was a kind of pilgrimage. You entered as a seeker and left as a witness. Some said the gods themselves must have envied the libraries of men, for they were proof that mortals too could create eternity. No one knew it then, but the people who built these early sanctuaries were shaping not just their own age, but all the ages to come. They taught the world that memory could be shared, that learning could be passed like a torch, that knowledge could have a home. It was the quiet beginning of the human archive, a network of light spanning continents and centuries. Every civilization would inherit that idea and make it its own. The Persians with their royal records, the Greeks with their scrolls of poetry and logic, the Egyptians with their houses of life, each adding another wall to the great invisible library that humanity still builds even now. And yet, for all their warpiness, the builders knew how fragile it all was. Clay could crack, papyrus could rot, ink could fade. Knowledge was always one step away from ash. Perhaps that fragility was what made it sacred, the awareness that something so delicate could still defy time. And so they guarded it, not just with stone and locks, but with reverence. For them, the library was not a place. It was a living being, a creature made of breath and memory, born from thousands of hands. To lose one was to lose part of the world itself. The first great libraries, Alexandria, Nineveh, Cordoba, did not appear by accident. They were the inevitable result of thousands of years of quiet faith. Faith in words, faith in the endurance of thought, faith in the flame that could outlast empires. Each of those cities became a vessel for the same purpose, to hold back the night. Alexandria sought to gather all knowledge. Nineveh carved eternity into clay. Cordoba lit the lamps that would become the Renaissance. They were not rivals, but chapters in one long story, the story of the builders of memory. To build a library is to make a covenant with time. It says, even if I am gone, this will remain. Even if my name fades, this will speak. And that covenant has never been broken. It still binds us. Every server that hums with data, every archive, every school, every mind, they are all heirs of that ancient vow. For in the end, the library is not a building. It is the act of remembering itself. And that act, that quiet, stubborn defiance, is what keeps the world alive. From dust and silence, they built the first temples of memory. But every temple needs a dream, a vision so vast it reaches beyond its walls. Our journey begins where that dream first took shape, by the sea, in a city of marble and flame, Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria, fire and memory, birth of a dream. At the meeting point of sand and sea, where the Nile breathes into the Mediterranean, a city was born, bright as a promise, restless as the tide. They called it Alexandria. It was to be the heart of the world. Founded by Alexander, built by kings who came after him, the city rose from the desert like a question. What if knowledge itself could be gathered, held, and made eternal? It was here, in this place between continents, that the dream of a universal library began. Ships came from every horizon, from Greece, Phoenicia, India, Egypt. Their sails carried not only goods, but stories, maps, languages, and laws. The harbor became a crossroads of minds. And as the ships unloaded their cargo, the rulers of Alexandria saw something greater than trade. They saw a new kind of empire, not built with armies, but with understanding, an empire of thought. And so they declared, every ship entering the port must surrender its manuscripts. The library's scribes would copy each one, keeping the original and returning the duplicate. Knowledge itself became tribute, the price for entering the city of wisdom. And with every arrival, the shelves grew heavier. It was Ptolemy I, Alexander's general and successor, who first gave the dream a home. He founded the Mauseon, the House of the Muses. Part temple, part university, part sanctuary, it was unlike anything the world had seen. Within its courtyards, scholars, poets, mathematicians, and astronomers lived and worked together, not for money, not for power, but for something purer, the pursuit of truth. Ptolemy's vision was not just to preserve knowledge, but to perfect it, to gather every text, every idea from every land under one roof. It was the first attempt at total memory. The library itself stood beside the Mausion, its halls lined with scrolls of papyrus, its air cool and sweet with ink and cedar. By some accounts, it held nearly 500,000 manuscripts, a river of words flowing through its corridors. In the mornings, the rooms filled with voices, teachers lecturing, students debating, the sound of footsteps echoing between marble columns. At night, the lamps were lit. Light rippled across the papyrus rolls like fire reflected on water. To walk through those halls was to walk through the mind of humanity itself. And outside, the sea whispered against the shore, a rhythm that matched the turning of the scrolls. The library was more than a building. It was a living organism, a vast network of thought and correspondence. Its scholars mapped the stars, measured the earth, recorded the rise and fall of tides. Eratosthenes, the librarian, calculated the circumference of the earth with nothing but shadows and string. Euclid built the laws of geometry that still shape the world we build today. Callimachus created the first library catalog, a system to organize the infinite. And in the lecture halls, poets wrote hymns to reason, philosophers argued with tenderness, and scientists watched the heavens for patterns of the divine. The library was not only preserving knowledge, it was creating it. To be a scribe in Alexandria was to live on the edge of eternity. Every day, hundreds copied scrolls by hand, bent over papyrus, breathing ink and salt air. They copied not for recognition, but for the quiet joy of knowing that their work would outlive them. They believed deeply that words were alive, and that to write was to keep them breathing. Each stroke of ink was a heartbeat, each page a prayer. To lose a scroll was a kind of death, to preserve one, a small resurrection. The library drew minds from every land: Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, Persian astronomers, Indian mathematicians. Each brought their own way of seeing. Each taught and learned in turn. The result was something humanity had never seen: a community where difference became wealth, languages blended, beliefs intertwined, ideas collided and reformed. If the ancient world had a soul, it lived here, among the shelves of Alexandria. But even dreams cast shadows. The scholars of Alexandria began to believe they could gather all knowledge, that nothing worth knowing would exist beyond their walls. It was a beautiful illusion, the thought that wisdom could be contained, that truth could be completed. The library was not yet a tragedy, but it was already fragile, because perfection never survives the world. Still, for a time, it seemed eternal, a lighthouse of thought beside the sea, its flame visible across the ages. When night fell, the city dimmed to embers, but the library remained awake. From the harbor, sailors could see its glow, a golden halo rising above the water. Inside, the scribes worked by lamplight, their shadows moving across the walls like ghosts of the future. Outside, the sea whispered, "Remember me." And the library did. It remembered everything. So the world's first temple of knowledge stood, a heartbeat made of papyrus and flame. For a few centuries, it seemed the dream would last forever. But every fire, no matter how carefully tended, eventually meets the wind. The Library of Alexandria had given birth to the idea of immortality. Soon it would teach the world that even immortality can burn. The sea remembers the light that once lived on its shore, and though the city still stands, the dream has already begun to flicker. The first fire is coming. The Garden of Thought, morning in Alexandria. The harbor glows gold with the first light, and the city hums like an idea waking from sleep. Somewhere in the marble courtyards of the Mausion, a reed pen dips into ink. The first word of the day is written. The air smells of salt and cedar, and from every window drifts the same sound, soft, rhythmic, endless. The sound of thought being made visible. The library is alive. To walk through Alexandria in its prime was to walk through a living mind. Every street corner whispered with debate. Philosophers argued over geometry beside spice merchants. Poets recited to fishermen. Astrologers sketched stars on the sand. Here, the boundaries between craft and philosophy vanished. To bake bread was a form of chemistry. To sail was an experiment in physics. To measure the Nile was to understand the heavens. The people of Alexandria did not separate life from learning. They believed that to understand the world was to honor it. And so, knowledge was not luxury, it was worship. Inside the Mosaeon, the day began with silence. The scholars rose at dawn, washed their hands and faces, and entered the halls with reverence. They ate together, slept in adjoining quarters, and dedicated every waking hour to discovery. There were astronomers mapping the stars, biologists dissecting fish from the harbor, geographers tracing coastlines on parchment, mathematicians drawing proofs that spiraled into infinity. Each worked for the same purpose: to find order in chaos, to reveal the hidden harmony of the universe. It was said that if you listened closely in the halls, you could hear the sound of the cosmos being translated into human language. One morning, a scholar named Eratosthenes noticed something strange. In the city of Cyane, far to the south, the sun stood directly overhead on the summer solstice. It cast no shadow. But in Alexandria, on the same day he saw that it did. He measured the angle of that shadow, and with only a stick, a well, and a mind unafraid of simplicity, he calculated the circumference of the earth. He was wrong by less than 1%. No one had ever done it before, to measure the size of a planet with nothing but sunlight and reason. When he wrote down his findings, he did so without pride. For him, it was not proof of genius, but of faith. Faith that the universe could be understood. Alexandria was not only home to scientists, it was also a sanctuary for poets, playwrights, and dreamers. They lived side by side, their works often indistinguishable. A mathematician might write in verse. A poet might calculate the rhythm of the tides. One evening, as legend tells, a philosopher and a sculptor debated the nature of beauty. The philosopher spoke of symmetry and proportion. The sculptor replied, "Then knowledge too must have a face." And so they began to map beauty itself, turning aesthetics into equations, and equations into art. To the Alexandrians, there was no separation between truth and beauty. To know something was to make it luminous. Centuries later, when the library's flame was fading, there lived a woman named Hypatia. She taught philosophy and astronomy to her students, speaking beneath the colonnades, the scrolls of Plato beside her. She was beloved and feared, for in her the last light of reason still burned. They said her mind was clear as starlight, and her voice could still a crowd. When fanatics came to destroy what remained of the library, they saw in her a symbol of everything they wished to silence. She was torn from her chariot and murdered in the streets, and yet her name never vanished. It became another kind of light, the memory of courage in a world losing its way. Hypatia's death was not the end of the library. It was its echo, the last note of a song too beautiful to be forgotten. For centuries before that tragedy, the library had been a pulse in the heart of the world. It was said that scrolls arrived faster than they could be copied, that debates lasted for days without pause, that students came from as far as India and Carthage to hear lectures beneath its marble dome. There was a sense that anything was possible, that truth itself was within reach. Some even believed the library would one day hold the secret of immortality, the formula to end ignorance and decay. They were not wrong, it did, but not in the way they imagined. The greater the light, the longer the shadow. As knowledge grew, so did pride. The scholars of Alexandria began to believe they had already found the answers to all things. They forgot that curiosity, not certainty, is what keeps the flame alive. And so the library began to change. Fewer discoveries, more debates, more guards, fewer open doors. The dream that had once reached for infinity started to fold in on itself. Even perfection, when untouched too long, begins to decay. Still for a time, the city remained radiant, its marble glowing beneath the desert sun, its harbor alive with sails and laughter. It was the world's brightest flame, and as every flame must, it began to tremble. No one noticed the first signs. A ship that would not return, a scholar exiled for his words, a rumor of war to the west. The lamp still burned, the scrolls still whispered, but somewhere beyond the horizon, a darker wind began to move. The sea that had once carried knowledge was preparing to bring fire, and the library, the dream of eternal memory, would face its first night. It began with smoke, not much, a single spark in the harbor, a shadow that no one noticed. But from that spark would rise the first great silence, the fire that tried to erase the memory of the world. The fire that tried to silence the world. It began with smoke. At first, it was only a rumor carried by the sea wind, a ship burning in the harbor, a faint orange reflection dancing on the marble walls. The scribes inside the library kept working, their quills scratching softly, their thoughts too deep to notice the change in the air. But outside, the city had begun to burn. In 48 BCE, during the war between Julius Caesar and the Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII, Alexandria became a battlefield. Caesar, besieged near the harbor, ordered the ships in port to be set ablaze to block his enemy's approach. The flames spread with the wind, from the docks to the warehouses, and from the warehouses to the lower city. By morning, the fire reached the library's docks. The sea hissed with heat, the air filled with the smell of papyrus and salt. The library, the mind of the world, began to burn. No one knows exactly how much was lost that day. Some say 40,000 scrolls, some say 400,000. No number could measure it. The sky above Alexandria turned the color of old parchment. Ash rained on the sea like gray snow. Sailors said the smoke smelled sweet, like honey, cedar, and ink, the scent of knowledge dying. And yet, even in that moment, the fire did not seem cruel. It was magnificent, alive. The city watched in silence as centuries of memory rose into the heavens like prayers on fire. The library did not die that day. Its heart survived, hidden, rebuilt, reborn. For generations after Caesar's war, scholars kept collecting and copying, moving what they could into new halls. Some inside the Serapeum, the great temple of the god Serapis. But time, like flame, is never done consuming. In the 3rd century CE, civil war came again to Alexandria. The Emperor Aurelian, fighting to reclaim the city, burned entire districts to the ground. The library, or what remained of it, was lost once more to smoke and shouting. The scrolls scattered again. Some fled east to Constantinople, some west to Carthage, some vanished forever. The light flickered, but it did not go out. 2 centuries later, as Christianity rose to power, the old temples of knowledge became dangerous places. Philosophy, science, and the old religions were seen by zealots as rivals to faith. In 391 CE, the Emperor Theodosius decreed that all pagan temples be closed or destroyed. The Serapeum, the last home of the library, was attacked. The marble statues were torn down, the scrolls, the instruments, the lamps, all cast into the streets. Some were burned, some trampled, some carried away in secret. And so, in fire and silence, the last chapter of the great library closed. Imagine it, a hall once filled with voices, now echoing only with footsteps and dust. The smell of oil and smoke, the faint imprint of shelves on scorched walls, a single scroll, half burned, fluttering in the wind. The silence afterward was unlike any other. It was not emptiness. It was absence, the weight of what had been lost. And yet, beneath the ash, something still glowed. For ideas once born do not burn. They drift, they hide, they wait. Even as the library fell, its students and scribes carried its light elsewhere. The mathematicians went to Athens and Syria, the astronomers to Persia, the doctors to Byzantium. They took with them copies, fragments, memories. The flame divided, scattered, but each fragment still burned. The words of Euclid, Archimedes, and Aristotle survived the fire's breath. In time, they would reach Baghdad, then Cordoba, then Florence. Each city would ignite anew. Each would call itself the heir of Alexandria. The fire had tried to erase the world's memory. Instead, it taught humanity how to remember differently. There is a strange mercy in destruction. Sometimes what burns becomes indestructible. The library's loss gave birth to myth, and myth, unlike buildings, cannot crumble. The world began to dream of Alexandria not as a ruin, but as an ideal, a place where every book is safe, every mind welcome, every truth free to exist. Even now, that dream lives. Every archive, every school, every screen glowing in the dark is an ember from that first fire. The library is gone, but its idea burns everywhere. From the ashes of Alexandria, humanity learned something profound. That knowledge is not a possession, it is a pilgrimage. It moves from one keeper to the next, one city to another, one age to the next. And so long as one person remembers, the library still stands. Every time we read, every time we write, we rebuild it. Brick by invisible brick, page by glowing page. Perhaps that is why the story of Alexandria endures, not as tragedy, but as transformation. For what the fire burned was only the body. What it left untouched was the soul. The great library was never truly destroyed. It simply changed form. From papyrus to paper, from paper to memory, from memory to light. And now it burns quietly in every human mind. But before Alexandria turned to ash, the world had already learned its lesson, that memory must live in more than walls. To carve knowledge into something eternal, humanity turned to the oldest material of all, the earth itself. The Phoenix of Alexandria. There is a silence that follows great loss, a silence so complete it almost hums. After the flames died and the last smoke drifted out to sea, Alexandria stood like a ghost of itself. The air was thick with the scent of ash and salt. The harbor reflected only gray light. But deep beneath the ruin, something was still alive. The dream was not gone. It had simply changed its body. They say that when the fire ended, some citizens stood by the shore for hours, watching the black water as if waiting for words to rise from it. Others swore they could still see a faint golden glow on the horizon long after the flames had died, as if the light of the library refused to leave the world. And perhaps it never did. Perhaps it simply scattered, fragmented like glass, each shard becoming a new beginning. The library had burned, but its memory was everywhere. It lived in the minds of those who had studied within its halls, and in the dreams of those who had only heard its name. From then on, Alexandria was no longer a city. It was a myth. It is strange how the world forgets facts, but never forgets longing. No one remembered exactly what the library looked like, how many columns it had, how many rooms, how the sunlight fell through its windows, and yet everyone remembered how it felt. The stillness, the wisdom, the sense of belonging to something vast. In this way, the library became immortal, not through preservation, but through imagination. Each generation remade it in its own image. To the Greeks, it was a temple of the muses. To the Arabs, a house of divine reason. To the Europeans, a lost paradise of intellect. The more the real library faded, the brighter the myth burned. Destruction, too, can illuminate. When the library vanished, the world was forced to rebuild its memory elsewhere. Knowledge dispersed like seeds in the wind. From its ashes, new centers of learning began to rise. Pergamon, Antioch, Constantinople, Baghdad, each carried something of Alexandria's spirit, its hunger for universality, its faith in human reason. The Muslim scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate, centuries later, would speak of Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in Baghdad, a place built in the image of the lost library. They translated Greek, Persian, and Indian works, preserving what the flames had missed. They saw themselves not as inventors, but as torchbearers. They said, "The light did not die, it only changed its language." The myth of Alexandria became a map. Artists painted it as a city of gold. Philosophers wrote of it as the cradle of reason. Travelers claimed to have seen fragments of its scrolls in faraway lands. Every library built after carried a little of its reflection. The high arches, the quiet halls, the endless shelves. Even today, when we walk into a great library, when the air cools, the noise fades, and the silence grows heavy, it is as if we step once again into Alexandria. We feel it without knowing, the weight of centuries in the hush between shelves. That sensation is the library's true resurrection, not in stone, but in atmosphere, the spirit of thought made physical. Alexandria's destruction should have been the end, but instead it became the beginning of a greater question. Can knowledge ever truly be lost? The answer came not from historians, but from poets and dreamers. They said the library never burned. It merely withdrew, hiding beneath the surface of time, waiting to return when the world was ready again. And in a way, they were right. Because ideas, once imagined, can never be unimagined. They remain in the collective mind of humanity, like embers waiting for breath. Centuries later, Alexandria would rise again. In 2002, beside the same Mediterranean shore, a new library opened its doors, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Its roof curves like the rising sun. Its walls are carved with letters from every known alphabet, a chorus of human language etched in stone. Inside, light spills across reading tables, and scholars from every nation once more gather to write, to study, to remember. It is not a copy of the ancient library, but its echo, a promise renewed. And on quiet days, when the sea breeze drifts through its windows, one might almost hear the faint rustle of papyrus, the whisper of ancient scribes. The flame is returned home. Perhaps this was always the library's true purpose, not to preserve knowledge, but to teach humanity what it means to lose it. Only through destruction do we understand the sacredness of memory. Only through forgetting do we learn how to remember. The library's death was not failure. It was initiation, a transformation from matter to meaning. For the first time, people began to understand that knowledge itself was alive, that it could travel, evolve, reincarnate. The fire was not its end, it was its metamorphosis. Today we live surrounded by libraries we cannot see, digital, invisible, infinite. Every search, every file, every stored word, it is another branch of the same tree that grew in Alexandria. It no longer needs walls or scrolls. It lives in us. When we read, we rebuild the library. When we teach, we expand it. When we dream, we remember it. The library never died. It only learned to take new forms. And as long as the world keeps thinking, it will continue to rise like a phoenix of light, forever reborn from its own ashes. But memory does not end at the sea. Even as Alexandria's embers cooled, another city waited in silence. One that carved its thoughts not on paper, but on earth itself. A place where the flame became stone and words learned to outlast fire. The weight of ashes. There is a strange stillness after something great disappears. The sea returns to calm. The sky clears. But the silence feels heavier than before, as if the world itself is trying to remember what it just lost. The Library of Alexandria was gone, yet its absence filled the earth like a shadow. People spoke of it for centuries, not as a ruin, but as a wound. And in that wound, something began to grow. The awareness that knowledge, like fire, cannot exist without danger. In every generation since, scholars have tried to imagine the moment when the last scroll turned to ash. They picture the smoke curling upward, the words dissolving into air, and wonder, did the world become smaller that day? Perhaps not. Perhaps it became deeper. Because in losing the library, humanity learned something no collection of books could ever teach. That wisdom is not in what we keep, but in what we cannot afford to lose again. Every archive, every school, every digital vault today exists because of that loss. The emptiness left by Alexandria became the foundation of all that followed. When archaeologists sift through layers of ancient earth, they often find only fragments: a piece of pottery, a shard of glass, a corner of a letter. And yet, from those fragments, entire civilizations are reborn. So it is with Alexandria. We do not possess its scrolls, but we possess the thought it inspired. The belief that memory must be protected, that learning must be shared, that no single flame is enough to light the world. The ashes of Alexandria became soil. From them grew every library that came after. The story of the library reminds us of a paradox, that immortality itself is fragile. Knowledge can be copied 1,000 times, stored, digitized, buried in vaults. But if no one reads it, if no one remembers why it mattered, it dies just as surely as papyrus in the fire. To preserve knowledge is not enough, it must be lived. That is the true weight of the library's ashes, a responsibility, not a relic. Each reader, each teacher, each curious mind inherits a small portion of that burden. When we open a book, we are not merely learning, we are continuing an ancient rescue. There is a deeper fire that no sea can drown. It burns not in parchment or ink, but in the human mind, the spark that drives us to ask, to record, to understand. The library may have been its most beautiful vessel, but the flame itself was never trapped there. It lives in every question that begins with why, in every voice that whispers, remember. Even now, in a world of screens and signals, that same hunger still glows beneath the surface. A faint, steady warmth, reminding us that thought itself is sacred. The scribes of Alexandria wrote with ink. We write with light, but the act is the same. Everything that lasts must learn how to change. That is the oldest lesson the fire ever taught us. The library did not survive by resisting destruction. It survived by transforming through it. Knowledge, like the phoenix, must burn to be reborn. For every scroll lost, a new way of remembering appeared. For every silence, a new language rose. We carry those transformations in our very nature. Each time we forget, we build new ways to remember. It is how humanity moves forward, by turning loss into architecture. Sometimes when the sea around Alexandria is still, divers claim they can hear faint sounds beneath the water, like paper rustling, like distant voices reading. Perhaps it's only the current through the stones. Or perhaps memory never truly leaves the places it once loved. The sea became the library's last archive. Its depths hold the echo of a dream that refused to vanish completely. And so the city that once contained all knowledge is now contained by the ocean. A fitting reversal. The earth remembers in its own way. The final gift of Alexandria was not its scrolls, but the realization that every human being is a library waiting to be opened. We store our stories in words, our truths in emotion, our lessons in silence. When one person teaches another, it is the same act that once filled those marble halls. Every conversation, every shared memory is a continuation of the same work, the endless transcription of the human spirit. We are all, in a sense, scribes of the invisible. The ancients built their libraries of stone and wood and watched them fall to dust. But perhaps the most enduring library is the one that weighs nothing, made of ideas, memory, and connection. A word spoken in truth travels farther than any scroll. A thought remembered in kindness lasts longer than any monument. And a dream, once shared, can outlive empires. That is what the library taught us. Not how to store knowledge, but how to give it wings. The Library of Alexandria was a miracle, but its ashes were an even greater one, for they proved that destruction cannot touch what is truly human. We are made of memory. We are built from the stories we refuse to forget. And so long as someone somewhere still dreams of that city by the sea, the lamps of Alexandria will never fully go out. The ashes of Alexandria drifted east, carried by wind and time. They settled in another land, one that wrote not with ink, but with earth itself. And from that earth, humanity built the next library of the world. The tablets of Nineveh, words in clay, the clay and the reed. Before there were books, before there were alphabets, before there was even the thought of forever, there was the earth, soft, pliable, silent. It held the footprints of animals, the mark of rain, the impression of hands. And somewhere in that wet brown surface, a human being saw the shape of possibility. If a handprint could remain, why not a word? No one knows his name. No one remembers the moment. But one day, tens of centuries ago, someone took a small reed, pressed it into clay, and left a mark that was not nature's. It was thought made visible. It may have been a count of grain, a record of trade, a prayer, or the name of a river. Whatever it was, it changed everything. The world had just invented writing. At first, the marks were simple. Triangles, wedges, lines. Each stood for a thing. A sheep, a person, a number. But slowly, the shapes began to mean not just objects, but ideas. The sign for head came to mean think. The sign for water came to mean life. The sign for star became God. In this way, clay became the mirror of the human mind, turning substance into symbol, matter into meaning. Writing was not born for poetry, it was born for memory. The scribes of Sumer and Akkad were the first true keepers of the flame. They worked in silence beside the river, rolling small tablets from wet earth, pressing them carefully with reeds cut to a sharp edge. The stylus clicked rhythmically, like rain on stone. Every mark had to be perfect. One mistake, one misplaced wedge, and a word could vanish or change meaning entirely. Their hands were steady, their eyes strained in the sun, their hearts carried the weight of knowing that they were writing for the future. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay was heavy, stubborn, eternal. It demanded patience and rewarded it with immortality. When the scribes finished their work, they left the tablets to dry in the heat. Some were hardened by the sun, others were baked in kilns, becoming as durable as stone. A word pressed into clay could last 1,000 years. And so it did. Empires fell, temples crumbled, languages vanished. But the tablets endured. They lay buried beneath deserts and ruins, silent in waiting. The earth had become the world's first library. At first, these tablets were lists, inventories of grain, tax records, laws. But soon humanity realized that the same symbols could capture not just goods, but dreams. Poems began to appear, prayers, stories of kings and greats. Among them, one tale would rise above all others, a story of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. It was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Carved into clay thousands of years ago, it remains the oldest surviving story on Earth. In it, Gilgamesh asks the question that has haunted humanity ever since. Must we all die, and is there nothing that can last? The answer came from the very material it was written on, for clay, unlike flesh, endures. Every tablet bore the mark of a hand, a thumbprint on the edge, a fingerprint near the corner. Those prints, still visible today, are the signatures of immortality. They remind us that behind every symbol was a person, a body that lived, sweated, hoped, and feared forgetting. The scribes were not poets or kings, but they were builders of time. Their work was humble, repetitive, yet divine in its purpose. Each day they pressed their thoughts into the earth, and in doing so, they made memory solid. To hold one of those tablets now is to touch the silence of the ancient world. The wedges and lines are not easy to read. They look like cracks in stone, like the language of the earth itself. But when translated, they speak with surprising familiarity. Contracts, disputes, love letters, recipes, even jokes. Their humanity is astonishing. The clay remembers not gods and empires, but people, their hopes, their arguments, their daily breath. The first libraries were not places of grandeur. They were storage rooms filled with dust and patience. Yet inside them, civilization was taking shape. It's easy to think of clay as lifeless, but the ancients believed otherwise. They said humans were made from earth, and that writing was a way for the earth to speak back. The clay was both medium and metaphor, a reflection of the human condition, soft, fragile, but capable of eternity when fired. In every baked tablet, there is a perfect echo of us, the will to leave something behind. When the first scribe pressed the first symbol, he did not just record a thought, he declared war on time. Millennia later, archaeologists digging in the ruins of Uruk and Nineveh would uncover tens of thousands of these tablets. Each one still legible, each one still whispering. The words of the first writers rose again into the sunlight, and as scholars brushed away the dust, they realized that they were not just reading history, they were listening to voices that had been silent for 4,000 years and still remembered. The earth, it turned out, had been keeping humanity's secrets all along. But where the first scribes pressed their thoughts into clay, another dreamed of gathering them, all of them, into one place, a king who saw not words, but power in memory itself. The first language of memory. When the first humans pressed symbols into clay, they were not trying to create beauty. They were trying to survive. The earliest tablets were ledgers, lists of grain, cattle, taxes and trade, marks for goods, signs for value, a way to measure what could be lost. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those marks began to change. The clay that once recorded things began to record thoughts. It began with small shifts. A scribe recording the king's tribute added a note about the weather. Another, in a law tablet, wrote a question. What is justice? A priest recording a ritual added a personal plea for mercy. And somewhere, deep in time, someone wrote something that no one had asked them to write. Something unnecessary, something beautiful. That moment was the birth of literature. For the first time, humans weren't just preserving memory, they were creating it. When language entered clay, the human voice gained its first echo. Before that, words lived only as sound, a breath, a vibration, gone in an instant. But now, a sentence could stay. A whisper could cross centuries. A single thought could wait patiently for someone yet unborn to find it again. Writing gave humanity its second breath, the power to speak beyond death. Each mark pressed into the tablet was a defiance of silence. And though the scribes may not have known it, they were giving shape to eternity. In Mesopotamia, writing was sacred. It was not a tool, it was a miracle. The scribes were not mere clerks. They were intermediaries between mortals and the divine. Each word was believed to have power, to heal, to curse, to summon, to bless. The god Nabu, patron of writing and wisdom, was said to inscribe the fates of all beings on clay tablets. Every writer in his own awe was imitating the gods. To write was to create. To read was to resurrect. The temple libraries were not schools, they were holy ground. Each tablet was a prayer in hardened earth. The more the scribes wrote, the more the clay began to think. It learned to describe love, grief, hunger, and fear. Poems appeared, short, simple, haunting. One tablet reads, "My friend, my companion, why have you gone away?" Another, "The river is my sister. Her song cools my heart." In these small fragments, we can feel the pulse of the ancient world, not in its kings and wars, but in its emotions. Through writing, the human heart found its first mirror. Over centuries, the clay archives of Mesopotamia grew immense. Kings ordered their deeds inscribed in stone. Priests copied myths and hymns. Scholars wrote dictionaries and star charts. Each tablet became a tiny tomb of thought, a resting place for a human mind. When archaeologists unearthed them millennia later, they found themselves surrounded by voices. Every crack, every line, every wedge spoke across the void of time. They were no longer reading about the past. They were listening to it, and it spoke with clarity, as if it had been waiting all along. The earliest philosophers did not have ink or scrolls. They had clay and a desire to understand the invisible. Why do floods come? Why do stars move? What is the soul made of? They pressed these questions into tablets, not knowing that they were inventing philosophy. In one Sumerian text, a teacher asks, "Who can know the will of the gods? Who can understand the heart of man?" No answer is given. The question itself is the beginning of wisdom. For the first time, humanity had written down its uncertainty, and in doing so, it made doubt sacred. The act of writing was not easy. A single tablet could take hours to make, a single library decades to fill. Each mark required strength and patience. The clay had to be prepared, the stylus cut to the right edge, the air dry enough for preservation. The scribes' world was one of discipline, but also devotion. They believed that what they wrote would outlast them, and they were right. Some of their words have survived longer than the cities they lived in, longer than their empires, longer than their bomb. The clay carried them forward, steady, silent, eternal. Writing began as imitation and a mark of ownership, a record of trade. But over time, it became self-aware. Humanity realized that to write was to preserve the self. The clay became a mirror, and the mirror became consciousness. The first language of memory was not about what people had, it was about who they were. When they pressed symbols into the earth, they pressed themselves. The world was no longer only a place to live, it became a place to remember. In time, the scribes began to dream of gathering their words together, not as isolated tablets, but as one great archive, a single place where all that had been written could live side by side. The idea of the library was already forming centuries before Alexandria. And when a king arose in Nineveh who loved words more than conquest, that dream would finally come true. The earth had given humanity a voice, and now one man sought to collect every whisper. A king whose palace would become the cradle of the world's first great library. The king's library, in the city of Nineveh, where the Tigris shimmered beneath the desert sun, stood a palace unlike any other. Its walls were carved with lions and chariots, its courtyards filled with marble and cedar, its gates guarded by winged bulls, half beast, half god, watching over the memory of the world. And within those walls lived a king who preferred scrolls to swords, ink to iron, and questions to conquest. His name was Ashurbanipal, the last great ruler of Assyria, and perhaps the first true librarian. Ashurbanipal was no ordinary monarch. He was trained as a priest and a scribe before he ever wore a crown. While his ancestors waged wars, he read. While generals sharpened spears, he sharpened reeds for writing. He could read Sumerian, Akkadian, and Elamite, languages that had already grown ancient in his time. He studied omens, mathematics, medicine, and law. He memorized the epics of old kings and debated with scholars about the movement of stars. He believed knowledge itself was a weapon, one sharper and far more enduring than any blade, and so he dreamed of building something eternal. Somewhere around 650 BCE, Ashurbanipal gave an order that would outlast his empire. Gather all the writings of the lands, let nothing be forgotten. Let the wisdom of the ancients live here. Messengers were sent across Mesopotamia, to Babylon, Uruk, Sippar, and beyond. They carried the king's decree to collect every tablet worth keeping, to copy every myth, law, and ritual, and to send them all to Nineveh. Soon caravans began to arrive, donkeys burdened with boxes of clay, scribes unloading crates by torchlight, couriers bent under the weight of history. The palace of Ashurbanipal became the heartbeat of the ancient world. Room after room filled with clay, shelves of wood, walls of stone, every surface lined with tablets, some the size of a hand, others as large as doors. Each tablet bore a small inscription at the bottom. Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria. It was not vanity, it was order. It meant, here memory has a home. Within those halls, scribes cataloged the impossible, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, geography, laws, hymns, prophecies, and myths. There were lists of plants and animals, instructions for rituals, manuals for exorcisms and surgeries. There were love songs, prayers, and curses. And among them, a masterpiece that would outlive empires, the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in 12 tablets, copied and recopied with care. It was here in Nineveh that the oldest story ever told was finally made immortal. To walk through the library was to hear a strange kind of music, the clicking of styluses, the gentle thud of drying tablets being stacked, the murmurs of scribes reading aloud as they wrote. Each sound was rhythmic, deliberate, a harmony between hand, mind, and earth. In that palace, the act of writing was sacred labor. Every tablet was born of collaboration. The scribe, the clay, the fire, and the divine. They worked not for fame, but for preservation. They believed they were building a bridge from one civilization to the next. And perhaps they were right. Ashurbanipal's library was the first to have an organizational system. Each tablet was labeled and classified by subject. The shelves were divided into categories: rituals, medicine, law, myths, correspondence, and science. Even damaged tablets were kept, carefully restored with copies and notes. For the first time in history, knowledge was not chaos. It was architecture. To walk through those halls was to walk through the mind of civilization itself. But knowledge is never without danger. Ashurbanipal's thirst for wisdom was endless, and in some ways ruthless. He plundered conquered cities for their text. He ordered libraries of Babylon and Ur to be copied and sent to Nineveh. Where others took gold, he took words. He believed that whoever possessed knowledge possessed destiny. In his letters he wrote, "I have read the cunning writings of the wise. I understand the hidden words of the tablets. None of the kings before me have learned what I know." To his enemies, he was a tyrant. To history, he was a savior. Both were true. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the city burned. Ashurbanipal's palace collapsed under flame and rubble. The wooden shelves turned to ash, but the tablets, the humble, heavy tablets, did not burn. The fire that destroyed the city baked them harder. In destruction, they found preservation. The earth itself sealed its memories in layers of ash and stone. For 2.5 millennia, they slept beneath the dust, until archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th century. When they were lifted from the soil, the marks still glistened. The words were still legible. The library of Ashurbanipal had outlived its kingdom. Ashurbanipal is long gone. His statues are broken, his empire erased, but the tablets remain. More than 30,000 of them now rest in museums around the world, silent, patient, undefeated. Through them, the king's dream continues. His wish to gather all knowledge was impossible, and yet, in a way, he succeeded. Because every library that followed, from Pergamon to Alexandria to the modern world, was born from his vision. He taught humanity the one truth every scribe, every thinker, every dreamer had to learn. Knowledge cannot be owned. It can only be kept, for a while. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the soft click of a stylus in wet earth echoing through time. The scribes of Nineveh may have thought they were writing for kings, but they were really writing for us. Each mark, each wedge, each breath was a message across the centuries. Remember me, remember us, and we have. But clay was not the only medium of eternity. Across the sea, another civilization learned to shape thought in stone and light. Their words carved not into earth, but into the very face of time. The stone and the light. When the age of clay passed, the world did not stop writing. It simply changed its hand. The reed stylus became a chisel. The tablet became a wall, and the soft rhythm of clay gave way to the ringing of stone. Civilization began to speak in monuments. The same impulse that once pressed wedges into mud now carved symbols into granite, not to be stored, but to be seen. The written word had found a new purpose, not preservation, but proclamation. The Egyptians were among the first to turn language into architecture. Their walls spoke. Every temple, tomb, and column was a page in a colossal book. The hieroglyphs shimmered with color in the torchlight. Lines of ghosts, kings, birds, and suns, each more than an image, each alive with meaning. The word itself to them was sacred. The Egyptian term for hieroglyph, medu netjer, meant words of the gods. Writing was not merely a human act, it was divine participation. When they carved a name into stone, they believed they were granting it life everlasting. For the Egyptians, to erase a name was the ultimate form of death. The body could decay, but as long as a name remained visible, the soul could continue its journey. That is why the walls of tombs were filled with spells and inscriptions, not for decoration, but for survival. Every letter was a ladder from mortality to immortality, and every scribe, with his chisel and pigment, was a priest of eternity. In this way, Egypt turned its language into stone prayers, monuments that could outlast the Nile itself. In the temples of Luxor and Karnak, you can still walk among the voices of the dead. Each column carries not just art, but thought. A story of the Maz, a record of seasons, a hymn to light. When sunlight falls across the carvings, the shadows bring them to life. It is as though the stone itself is whispering its ancient song back into the air. Even broken, even faded, the words continue to speak. Time erodes everything, but light keeps rewriting them. Every civilization after Egypt would follow its example, to carve, to engrave, to inscribe. The Greeks etched their laws into marble slabs so that no ruler could erase them. The Persians chiseled their victories deep into the cliffs of Behistun. In India, Emperor Ashoka ordered moral teachings carved on pillars so tall they could be seen from the horizon. In each case, writing was not private, it was public. It was the language of power set against the silence of nature. And for the first time, the written word became landscape. Unlike the clay tablets, stone could not be hidden or burned. What was written on it was meant to endure exposure, to sky, to rain, to time. Kings began to see in writing a promise of immortality that conquest could not provide. Empires fell, armies vanished, but the inscriptions remained. 1,000 years later, the names of those kings would still be legible, even when no one remembered their cities. Writing had become the final triumph of power, a monument to the belief that thought could stand against time. For the Greeks, stone was not just a surface, it was an idea. They inscribed laws, oaths, and philosophies on the same marble that built their temples. To carve words into stone was to declare them eternal truths. The phrase written in stone comes from this age, a reflection of the belief that some knowledge should never be rewritten. And yet, in their academies and theaters, the Greeks discovered something new, that knowledge too must breathe. While their inscriptions immortalized, their dialogues liberated. Plato's words, though written on fragile papyrus, would outlast any wall. The Greeks, more than anyone before, understood the paradox of permanence. To endure, an idea must remain alive. In carving stories into the face of the earth, humanity discovered a new kind of library, one built not of shelves but of mountains and pillars. Each temple became a chapter, each wall a sentence, each statue a symbol. You could walk through the city and read it, and in the rhythm of its streets, in the alignment of its stones, you could feel that language was no longer confined to script. It had become environment. Humanity had learned to live inside its own story. But even stone is not eternal. Wind wears it down, rain smooths it, the desert swallows it whole. The pyramids stand, but their colors are gone. The walls of Persepolis rise, but their meanings fade. Every mark carved by human hands must eventually yield to the patience of the earth. And so, once again, memory began to look for a new home. It would find it in scrolls, in ink, and in the dream of a universal library, a place where stone could finally speak softly. Even as the words crumble, the lesson remains clear. We carve, we write, we build. not to defy time, but to remember what it feels like to live within it. Stone taught humanity permanence. Clay taught it humility. Papyrus would teach it imagination. Together they formed the trinity of memory: earth, light, and thought. The Library of Alexandria, centuries later, would be born from this lineage. The final evolution of the same impulse: to speak across time, to keep the silence from closing in. But before the walls of marble, before the scrolls of Alexandria, there was one more revelation, a discovery written not by kings or gods, but by the light itself. The writing of the sun. Before humans learned to carve stone, before they molded clay, they learned to see. On the walls of caves and cliffs, light shifted like thought, rising, fading, returning. It painted shapes without hands and cast moving shadows that told the story of time itself. Before there were scribes, there was the sun, and it wrote across the earth every day. Long before alphabets, the earth was a book. Each dawn, the mountains became letters of gold. Each evening, the shadows drew sentences on the ground. Humans began to read these patterns, not with their eyes, but with awe. The changing light told them when to plant, when to hunt, when to pray. It shaped their calendars, their myths, their sense of rhythm. The first written record was not pressed into clay or carved into stone. It was written in sunlight, a language that needed no translation. Then came those who tried to answer the sun with their own light, the artists of the caves. In the darkness of Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet, they painted with fire. Their hands became brushes. Their breath became illumination. Their pigments, ashes, ochre, blood, shone like captured daylight on stone. When the torches flickered, the painted animals seemed to move. A bison charging, a horse galloping, a herd flowing across the cave wall. It was not art, it was the birth of cinema. The world's first projection was firelight on stone. The first story, a shadow moving across time. Thousands of years later, humans began to harness the light directly. In ancient Egypt, they built the sundial, a device that turned shadow into meaning. A single rod, standing in sunlight, cast a moving mark across stone. Each hour was a line, each day a circle. It was not just a way to measure time, it was a way to see it. For the first time, the invisible became visible. The passing of hours was no longer a feeling, it was a written fact. The sun itself had become a pen. The Egyptians and Greeks built their temples not only for gods, but for light. Every column, every wall was designed to catch the sun at one specific moment: a solstice, a dawn, a sacred day. In Abu Simbel, the morning light travels through the temple once a year to touch the statues of the ones seated within. A golden beam piercing the darkness, illuminating eternity for a single heartbeat. It is not coincidence, it is writing. Each year the light repeats its message. The world still moves, the gods still see, time still remembers. Elsewhere in China and Mesoamerica, architects aligned cities with the stars. The sun at zenith, the moon's shadow during eclipse, each became part of an invisible text. Stone mirrors and bronze discs captured sunlight, focusing it into beams for ritual. Some cultures believed that the reflected ray was a thread between worlds, the sun writing on the skin of the living. They read omens in its shimmer, prophecies in its warmth. Light became law, shadow became scripture. The cosmos was not silent, it was speaking in radiance. To the Greeks, light was knowledge itself. Plato imagined a cave, not unlike Lascaux, where humans mistook shadows for truth. His allegory became a lesson about perception and reality, about the difference between image and essence. The play of light and darkness was no longer just natural, it was intellectual. To seek wisdom was to turn toward the light. To remain ignorant was to stay among shadows. And so the oldest metaphor in the world was born: light as truth. Unlike clay or stone, light leaves no mark. It cannot be stored. it cannot be owned, and yet its writing covers everything. It glows through leaves, paints the faces of mountains, spills across water. Every sunrise rewrites the world. Every sunset erases it, only to begin again. It is the most ancient script, the one that needs no translation, the one that no fire can destroy. In a way, all other writing has been an attempt to imitate it, to make permanence out of something fleeting, to hold the brightness for a moment longer. And so the story loops back, from clay to light, from permanence to impermanence. The first language, the language of the sun, is also the last. Every civilization has tried to capture it, with mirrors, with gold, with words, but none has succeeded completely. Because light was never meant to be owned, it was meant to be shared. It touches everything, forgets nothing, and leaves behind only warmth. A promise that even when night comes, memory glows. When humanity first learned to write, it borrowed from the sun. When it learned to preserve, it borrowed from clay. When it learned to dream, it borrowed from shadow. And somewhere within us still, these languages intertwine, the earth, the stone, and the light, whispering in unison, "We remember you." Every word we write today, every screen that glows in the dark, is the same impulse reborn, the wish to make the invisible visible, the wish to let light speak once more. And so the journey continues, from light to ink, from reflection to revelation. The next chapter begins not in caves or temples, but in a place where knowledge learns to breathe again, the night libraries of the world. The night libraries of the world, the fire that reads. There is a sound that belongs only to night, a quiet rustle of pages, a whisper of ink, a slow turning of thought. Every library has its own silence, but the deepest one comes at hour after sunset. Outside, the world forgets itself. Inside, light pools in small circles. And between them, the shadows breathe. This is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of attention, the hush that follows when the fire begins to read. Fire has always been our oldest companion. It cooked our food, warmed our shelters, and kept the beasts away. But it did something greater. It gave us time. With light, we could stay awake beyond dusk. With warmth, we could gather and speak. With fire, we could tell stories. Around it, language was born. Around it, memory became ritual. And when we first began to write, we placed the lamp beside us, so the words could see what we were doing. Even now, every library in the world is just a more patient campfire. Its glow is gentler, its audience quieter, but the purpose is the same, to remember together. In every age, there have been keepers of the flame, the watchers who stayed awake so that knowledge would not vanish while others slept. In ancient Alexandria, lamps burned through the dark as scribes copied scrolls into the dawn. In medieval monasteries, monks bent over parchment by candlelight, their faces pale with devotion. In Cordoba, the scholars of Al-Andalus translated Aristotle into Arabic, their pens gliding like sparks. In the libraries of Timbuktu, desert winds whispered through thousands of manuscripts, while lanterns glowed softly in earthen rooms. The world has always had its night guardians, those who believe that even in darkness, the mind must stay awake. The night library is not about brightness, it is about endurance. Each lamp burns just enough to make the next line visible. The light moves slowly, revealing one idea at a time, as though it too were learning to read. The reader and the flame share the same rhythm: breath, pause, flicker. In that glow, you can almost hear the centuries conversing: the clay of Nineveh, the papyrus of Alexandria, the parchment of Cordoba, all whispering into the modern page. It is as if light itself remembers where it came from. To read at night is to participate in an ancient ritual. You join a lineage that stretches back thousands of years, from the first fires in caves to the last stars above the earth. Each time your eyes move across a line, you are adding to the same invisible library, the one built inside the human mind. Reading is not consumption, it is caretaking. You take in a thought, you protect it, and if you are kind, you pass it on. That is the law of the night library. But the night library is more than a place of knowledge. It is a place of dreams. The glow of a lamp has always blurred the line between study and imagination. How many discoveries began as a wandering thought beneath a small, trembling flame? How many inventions, poems, and revolutions were born not in daylight, but in the patience of midnight reading? The night is not absence, it is incubation. It is where ideas rest before they awaken. By day, knowledge is proud. It is public, declarative, loud. But by night, it becomes humble again. It returns to its source, to whisper, to listen, to doubt. The shadows remind us that what we know is always smaller than what we don't. That is why true wisdom prefers dim light. It hides just enough to make us reach further. Each page turned under lamplight is an act of faith, a belief that what waits in the dark is worth discovering. Throughout history, civilizations have risen and fallen, but the lamps have never all gone out. When the Library of Alexandria burned, its flame leapt into other hands. When the monasteries of Europe closed, their manuscripts sailed east. When empires collapsed, knowledge hid in tiny rooms, waiting for dawn. Every book you touch, every page you open, is a descendant of that unbroken flame. You can feel it in the warmth of your fingertips, the inheritance of light. In truth, the night library is not only a place, it is a condition of the soul. Anyone who reads, truly reads, carries a small lamp inside them. It is lit by curiosity, fueled by memory, and kept alive by wonder. You don't need shelves for it. You don't need silence. You only need to care that something fragile survives until morning. Every reader is a custodian of fire. Every library, a constellation of glowing minds. The world is changing again. Books become pixels, libraries become clouds of data, and still we sit in front of screens that glow like lamps, reading words that drift through the dark. The tools have changed, but the ritual has not. We are still the same species, gathered around the fire, listening to stories that help us remember who we are. That is the true night library, the one inside us, fueled by the oldest flame in the world. The fire reads, it reads us, and in its quiet warmth, the memory of the world turns another page. The city that dreamed of books. In the 10th century, when much of Europe was still waking from its long, dark sleep, there rose in the south of Spain a city of impossible light. Its streets were narrow but gleaming, its courtyards filled with fountains and orange trees, its air perfumed with jasmine and ink. This was Cordoba, the jewel of Al-Andalus, a city where the night never truly fell, because even when the lamps went out, the books continued to shine. In the year 961, a scholar king ascended the throne, Al-Hakam II. He loved books more than battles. He filled his palace not with gold, but with scrolls. He sent emissaries across the Islamic world, to Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, with one command: bring me every book worth reading. And they did. Caravans returned to Cordoba loaded with manuscripts, mathematics from Persia, medicine from Alexandria, philosophy from Greece, poetry from Arabia. Soon his library contained over 400,000 volumes, at a time when the greatest libraries in Europe held barely a few hundred. It was said that even the catalog of his library filled 44 books, each title, each author, each topic, carefully written, a map of the human mind. The Royal Library stood near the Great Mosque, where courtyards of marble reflected the night sky. By day, sunlight streamed through arches of red and white. By night, hundreds of lamps burned, their flames mirrored in pools of water. It was said that from the rooftops of Cordoba, you could see the glow of the library from miles away, a golden pulse in the darkness. Inside, scribes and scholars worked through the night. They copied, translated, debated. They wrote commentaries on Aristotle, composed new works in astronomy and law, and preserved texts that would have vanished forever had they not passed through these hands. Each table was a world, each scribe a galaxy maker. The scholars of Cordoba believed that knowledge was not owned. It was shared, like starlight. Arabic, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew mingled on the same pages. In this city, a Jewish philosopher could study Plato from a Greek text translated by an Arab poet and later retranslated into Latin for a Christian scholar in Paris. It was not just tolerance, it was synthesis. The Library of Cordoba was not a fortress of knowledge, it was a bridge. And across that bridge, civilizations shook hands. In Cordoba, to read was not enough. One had to speak the language of the text and then give it new life in another. This was the age of translation, when thought learned to travel. The scholars of Al-Andalus became the world's interpreters, turning Greek into Arabic, Arabic into Latin, and Latin into the universal tongue of curiosity. They believed that language was not a barrier, but a lens, each translation another way to see the same truth. They were right. From their desks, the Renaissance would one day awaken. At night, the copyists worked by lamplight. You could hear the faint rhythm of pens scratching against parchment, a sound like rain on stone. They dipped their reeds into ink made from soot, honey, and water. Their fingers were always stained black, their eyes weary, but their hearts full. They knew they were doing sacred work, not for God alone, but for humanity. Some wrote on astronomy, mapping the moon's silver path. Others cataloged herbs, drew diagrams of the human heart, or described the shape of distant lands. Theirs was the work of eternity, done quietly under the same stars they were trying to understand. By the end of the 10th century, Cordoba was a city of learned merchants. In its streets, you could buy ink, parchment, and rare manuscripts the way others bought spices or silk. There were book markets where scholars debated prices, compared editions, and argued about translation accuracy. In some homes, private libraries contained thousands of volumes. Children learned to read before they could count. Women studied philosophy and medicine. Poets competed with astronomers to describe the heavens more beautifully. Cordoba was not just a city, it was an awakening. But all light casts a shadow. After Al-Hakam's death, politics turned against intellect. Rivalries flared. Fanatics rose. In 1013, the library was plundered. Scrolls were thrown into the streets. Pages burned in the courtyards where they once illuminated the night. The wind carried away the ashes of centuries, but the idea they had already crossed the sea. In Toledo, Paris, Venice, the light of Cordoba took new form. What had been destroyed in one city was reborn in another, as it always is. Today, Cordoba is quiet. Its streets still smell of oranges and dust. The great mosque stands in stillness, its arches like verses in stone, but at night when the moon rises, you can still imagine the glow. Lamps burning beside shelves, students whispering, pens whispering back. The city is gone, but its dream remains, a place where knowledge belonged to everyone, and the night was never dark enough to stop it. Cordoba taught the world a final lesson, that libraries are not built only of books, they are built of belief. Belief that knowledge can unite what power divides. Belief that light shared is never lost. From the ashes of Cordoba came the Renaissance, the universities of Europe, the printing press, and every lamp that still burns for learning. The fire that once read beneath Moorish arches now glows inside every school and screen. It is still the same flame. The lamps of Cordoba dimmed, but their reflection moved on, across oceans and centuries, to every place where the night meets a page. The guardians of silence. The wind outside the monastery howls like a wounded thing. Snow falls across the hills, and the bell tolls. Once, twice, 3 times. Inside, a single room glows. A candle flickers. The sound of quills scratching parchment fills the air. Slow, steady, endless. It is the 13th century. Europe sleeps in the dark. But here, in this stone fortress, the light of the mind is still awake. When Rome fell, its libraries fell with it. Scrolls burned, languages vanished, and centuries of thought dissolved into ash and rumor. But in the remote monasteries of Ireland, France, and Italy, a new kind of library was being born. Not of marble or gold, but of patience. These places were not grand. They were cold, damp, and silent. The shelves were few, the windows small. But within them lived the last keepers of knowledge, men who had taken vows of silence and turned that silence into preservation. At dawn, the monks gathered in the scriptorium, a long, narrow hall filled with desks and low lamps. The air smelled of wax, dust, and animal skin. Each monk took his place, his tools simple: a quill, a knife, a pot of ink, and a sheet of vellum, parchment made from calfskin. He bowed his head and began. The letters formed slowly, ornate, deliberate, precise. To copy a single book could take months. To copy the Bible, years. Every stroke was a prayer, every pause a meditation. They were not just writing, they were listening. For them, the word was sacred, not because of what it said, but because it survived. The monks spoke little. Their world was rhythm and repetition, a discipline of devotion. They believed that through copying, they were copying not just text, but truth. Their quills whispered across the page like wings in snow. In the stillness, time thickened. Hours became days. Days became seasons. And still, they wrote. It was said that if one listened carefully, the sound of the scriptorium was the heartbeat of civilization itself, slow, patient, unwavering. Some monks were not content merely to copy. They painted. They filled the margins of the books with gold leaf and tiny images, dragons curling through the initials, flowers blooming from the edges of psalms, saints glowing with halos of real light. These were the illuminators, and their art was not decoration, it was resurrection. To illuminate meant to bring to light. Their pages shimmered like stained glass. Each book became a cathedral small enough to hold in one's hands. In a world of shadow, they painted the light back into being. Books were chained to desks, not to keep them from being read, but to keep them from being lost. They were too precious, too rare, too slow to make again. A single volume was worth the price of a house. And yet, the monks made them freely, knowing that one day someone they would never meet would read these same lines. It was an act of faith across centuries. One hand passes the flame to another. The chain never breaks. The work was not romantic. The ink froze in winter. The candles smoked. The vellum cracked. Many went blind from strain. Some died before finishing a single manuscript. But they never stopped, because in their silence they believed they were preserving the voice of God, and unknowingly the voice of the world. Their labor saved not only scripture, but philosophy, science, and literature. Thanks to them, the words of Aristotle, Virgil, and Plato survived the centuries. Without them, the Renaissance would have had nothing to remember. Every finished manuscript was a living thing. Its cover was leather, its veins were ink, its heartbeat, the turning of pages. When a monk completed a book, he wrote a small line at the end, a colophon. Some were prayers, may the hand that wrote this be blessed. Others, exhaustion. As the sailor longs for port, so the writer longs for the last line. A few humor. Whoever steals this book, may he be cursed forever. Even in silence, their humanity glowed through the words. Over time, the monasteries became libraries. Rows of manuscripts, bound in wood and brass, stacked beneath arched ceilings. Candles burned low, casting halos on the pages. It was said that if you stood in one of those rooms at night, you could feel the walls breathing, the memory of centuries held in quiet anticipation. These were not public libraries, they were sanctuaries of thought, places where knowledge learned to sleep, but never to die. Centuries later, when Europe rediscovered curiosity, it was to these monasteries that scholars came. They unchained the books. They carried them into cities. They copied them again, translated them, and set them free. The monks had not known what they were saving, but they had saved everything. The silence of the scriptorium had become the foundation of the modern mind. Every word you read today in a book, on a screen, in a whisper, is born from those rooms. Their patience became our progress. Their devotion, our inheritance. They were the guardians of silence, and their silence became language again. If you listen closely at night, you can still hear them. The faint scratch of quills carving time into meaning. It is the sound of humanity remembering itself. The candle gutters, the page dries, and somewhere deep in the dark, a new reader opens the same book. The silence continues to speak. The dawn of ink and paper in the east, where the rivers flowed like ribbons of glass, where bamboo whispered in the wind, and ink was blacker than night, the written word was reborn. It no longer hid in monasteries. It walked among the people. And for the first time in history, knowledge could travel faster than footsteps. It began with paper. For thousands of years, humans had written on what they could find: stone, clay, silk, and skin. Each material had its weight, its cost, its limits. But in the 2nd century BCE, in the court of the Han dynasty, a man named Kai Lun looked to the trees. He ground mulberry bark, hemp, and rags into pulp, mixed it with water, and spread it across a fine bamboo screen. When it dried, it was thin as breath, light as air, and yet strong enough to hold eternity. Paper. The invention did not roar like thunder. It whispered, and the world changed forever. Ink, too, evolved. The Chinese had long used soot mixed with glue, pressed into small, solid cakes. When ground with water on a stone, it released a dark, velvety black, the color of the raven's wing. To them, ink was not just material, it was spirit. The 4 treasures of the scholars, the brush, the ink, the paper, and the inkstone, were sacred instruments, each treated with reverence. To write was to meditate. To paint was to breathe thought into matter. Every stroke was alive. Every page a world in miniature. Then came the miracle of multiplication. In the Tang dynasty of Baoan, around the 8th century, someone carved words and images into wooden blocks, inked them, and pressed paper upon them. The first printed sutras were born, Buddhist prayers that could be copied endlessly, spreading wisdom farther than any monk could travel. Soon, paper scrolls became common, then bound books, thin, portable, democratic. Knowledge no longer belonged to the few. It had begun to flow like water. In the 11th century, a man named Bi Sheng invented something even greater: movable type. He carved individual characters into clay, baked them, and arranged them into words. Now a page could be rearranged, a sentence rewritten, a thought replicated at will. It was the first whisper of what Gutenberg would one day shout to the world. Bi Sheng's name faded into obscurity, but his idea that words could be built, rebuilt, and spread infinitely was immortal. When printing reached Korea and Japan, it became an art. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, combined poetry, calligraphy, and image. The written word danced with color. Paper carried not just knowledge, but beauty. Even philosophy changed its rhythm. A text could now travel faster than a teacher. An idea could outlive its author. Paper had made memory mobile. Printing had made it contagious. Through the Silk Road, paper crossed deserts and seas. It reached Samarkand, then Baghdad. There, Arab scholars embraced it eagerly. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became the heart of a new intellectual world. They translated Greek and Persian works, wrote treatises on mathematics, chemistry, and medicine, and bound them in soft paper volumes that could fit in a traveler's satchel. Paper made knowledge light enough to move, and movement made it infinite. By the 12th century, paper reached Europe. It entered monasteries first, then universities, then cities. Each arrival was a quiet revolution. And then in the 15th century, a goldsmith from Mainz forged the tool that would turn whisper into roar, the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg took the old dream of Bishung and gave it iron lungs. His press could print hundreds of pages a day, each identical, each perfect. The first great book it produced was not a law or a charter, but a Bible, a symbol that the divine word belonged to everyone who could read. And just like that, the world multiplied. The Renaissance spread through Europe like dawn through glass. Science, philosophy, poetry, rebellion, all born from ink and pressure, from patience and gears. Paper does not endure like stone, yet it travels farther. It burns easily, yet it multiplies faster than fire. It carries both fragility and power, the perfect metaphor for thought itself. Every page is a bridge between silence and voice, between one human and another. And when held up to the light, you can sometimes see the faint texture of its making, the ghost of water and fiber, the echo of the hand that pressed it. Even the smallest scrap of paper is a fossil of intention. Paper gave humanity a new rhythm, faster, freer, infinite, no longer the guarded flame of the monks, no longer the silent archive of stone. Now thought could run. From China to Europe, from scrolls to screens, the same impulse continues to make the invisible visible. The libraries of the night grew brighter, louder, closer to us all. And yet, beneath every book, every page, you can still feel the pulse of the old fire, the ancient lamp that once read beside a sleeping world. Paper was born from trees, ink from ash, and thought from silence. Together they formed the new dawn, a dawn that has never truly ended. The flame of Alexandria, it begins with a coastline. The Mediterranean stretches like a mirror, and at its edge, a lighthouse pierces the horizon. The Pharos, a tower of fire guiding ships to the shore of knowledge. Beneath its light lies the city of Alexandria, founded by a conqueror, but made eternal by the dreamers who came after him. A city of scholars, a city of scrolls, a city that believed the universe could be written down. After Alexander the Great's death, his general Ptolemy I Soter took Egypt as his kingdom. But his ambition was not war, it was wisdom. He wanted to make Alexandria the intellectual heart of the world. He built the Mausoleum, a temple to the Muses, and within it, the Library of Alexandria. His vision was audacious. Let all knowledge of all nations be gathered here. It was the first universal library, not for religion or law, but for curiosity itself. And soon, ships arriving at the harbor were ordered to surrender their scrolls for copying. Originals went into the library, copies returned to the owners. Every word the world possessed was slowly drawn toward one point of light. No one knows exactly how many texts were kept there. Some say 500,000, others 1,000,000. Shelves of papyrus scrolls filled endless corridors, each scroll labeled carefully, mathematics of Euclid, poems of Sappho. On the heavens, Aristotle. On medicine, Hippocrates. Every discipline had a home, every language a voice. It was said that to walk the halls of Alexandria was to walk through the human mind itself. And at its center, a single belief burned, that knowledge, like fire, grows when shared. The library drew thinkers from across the ancient world, Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Jewish mystics, Persian astronomers, Indian mathematicians. Here, Eratosthenes measured the earth using only shadows and sunlight. Herophilus studied anatomy, becoming the first to understand the pulse of the human heart. Euclid taught geometry, the architecture of reason itself. And in the observatories above the library, astronomers charted the heavens, believing that to map the stars was to read the handwriting of creation. But Alexandria's true brilliance was not its books, it was its questions. The scholars gathered daily in open courtyards to debate under the sky. What is the nature of the soul? How far does light travel? Does time itself have a beginning? Their discussions echoed through marble halls, mingling with the sounds of waves and wind. They did not fear disagreement. They believed truth emerged only through collision. that every argument was a spark lighting the next discovery. In this city, to think was to burn brightly. But every light casts a shadow and no fire burns forever. Alexandria's fate came slowly in waves of loss. The first blow struck when Julius Caesar, trapped in the city during a civil war, set fire to enemy ships in the harbor. The flames spread, they reached the docks, and the warehouses where scrolls were stored. Thousands of texts burned. The smoke carried the smell of ink and papyrus across the sea. Caesar wrote later that he regretted the loss, but history had already changed course. Centuries later, new rulers came and went. Christian, Roman, Arab, each time the library's remnants were attacked, neglected, or forgotten. Some say it was destroyed by decree, others that it simply faded away, book by book, lamp by lamp. No one truly knows when it died. Perhaps it never did. Perhaps its fire escaped long before the walls fell, carried by travelers, scholars, and storytellers to every corner of the world. The library's body was lost, but its spirit multiplied. The dream of Alexandria never vanished. Every great library since has been a reflection of it. Pergamon, Baghdad, Cordoba, Oxford, Paris, Istanbul, all born from the same yearning, to preserve what we love against the oblivion of time. In 2002, Egypt built the Bibliotheca Alexandrina on the same shore where the old one once stood. A vast glass disc tilted toward the sea, as if still waiting for ships to bring knowledge home. Its walls are carved with letters from every alphabet known to humanity. When the morning sun hits them, the entire facade glows. It is the flame made solid again. The Library of Alexandria was both miracle and warning. It showed us how high curiosity can rise and how fragile it remains. It taught that knowledge, like fire, must be tended carefully, shared, never hoarded. That to burn is not to destroy, but to illuminate. The library's fall reminds us that every generation must choose whether to keep the light alive or to let it fade into smoke. Every screen that glows, every archive, every file stored in the cloud is a descendant of Alexandria. We have rebuilt it, not in marble or papyrus, but in code and light. The dream remains the same, to hold everything we know in one endless conversation. And perhaps, somewhere across time, the scholars of old can still hear us whispering through the data, still asking their questions, still turning the same invisible pages. The library burned, but the fire did not die. It leapt from scroll to scroll, from mind to mind, until the whole world was reading by its light. The whisper of pages. The night is still. Outside, the wind moves through the trees like slow water. Somewhere in the distance, a lamp flickers, and a reader leans closer to the page. The story is almost over, and yet it continues, because every ending in the history of knowledge is just another turning of the page. Humanity has never stopped trying to remember itself. We built our first thoughts in clay. We carved our questions into stone. We painted our dreams with firelight. We copied our prayers in ink. We multiplied our words with machines. We stored our hearts in glass and code. Every age believed it was the last keeper of knowledge. Every age was wrong. Memory does not die, it changes form. There are libraries built of marble, of paper, of servers, and glass. But the greatest one is invisible. It lives inside us. Every time we learn, we add a shelf. Every story we love becomes a room. Every forgotten thing remains, waiting quietly for rediscovery. Our minds are the true Alexandria, endlessly rebuilt, forever burning, never entirely lost. When we close our eyes, the books open inward. Think of them, the nameless hands across centuries who refused to let the flame go out. The scribe bent over his clay tablet, the monk hunched by candlelight, the scholar of Cordoba translating through the night, the printer covered in ink, the child today scrolling through words that began before time. All of them connected, each one part of the same relay, passing the fire forward, page by page. We inherit more than knowledge. We inherit devotion. There is a secret to every library. It is not in the books, but in the space between them. That pause, that silence, is where thought lives. When a reader lifts their eyes from the page, the words take root in that silence. They mix with memory, with feeling, with time. And in that stillness, they grow. Knowledge is not just transmission, it is transformation. What we read changes what we are. If the sea remembers every river, then the library remembers every word, even those that were lost. The burned scrolls of Alexandria, the shattered tablets of Nineveh, the drowned cities beneath the waves. Their essence survives in echoes, because every rediscovery, every invention, is just the world remembering itself again. We are the memory of the earth, and the books are the fossils of our imagination. Now the fire burns in pixels. Our libraries float in clouds of data, weightless, endless, bright. 1,000 years ago, a scholar might spend a lifetime searching for a single lost book. Now we carry millions in our pockets. And yet, the act is the same. When we open a screen in the dark, its glow falls across our face the same way lamplight once did. We still lean close, still read slowly, still seek the same warmth. Technology has changed the tools, but not the tenderness. The reader remains. The world breathes through its libraries. Every time a page turns, a little air moves, a small exhalation from the lungs of history. It's the same breath that once stirred the ashes of Alexandria, the same wind that carried clay dust from Nineveh, the same breeze that turned parchment in the hands of monks. Each reader adds to it, each one another breath in the wine respiration of humanity. We are all part of the same inhale, the same exhale. The night has always been the friend of thought. It softens noise, slows time, and leaves room for questions. In the dark, we see what light hides. We remember, we imagine. All libraries are night libraries in the end, not because they lack light, but because they shelter it. They are constellations of pages, stars of ink and silence, guiding us across the black sea of forgetting. Somewhere in a future we'll never see, someone will open a book, perhaps digital, perhaps physical, perhaps written in a language we cannot yet imagine. They will sit in the quiet and begin to read. They will feel the same pull of curiosity, the same small warmth of discovery that once moved the hands of scribes and scholars long ago. And in that moment, the entire lineage of human thought will live again, as alive as the first spark, as fragile, as infinite. Listen closely. That faint sound you hear, like paper moving, like breath in the dark, is the voice of the centuries. It says, do not forget. It says, keep the flame. It says, you are the library now. The candle gutters, the page closes, the night deepens, and still the light remains. Because knowledge was never truly about books or tablets or ink. It was always about connection, about the moment when one mind touches another through the fragile medium of time. That touch is eternal. That touch is the whisper of pages. Somewhere, a page turns. Somewhere, a light stays lit. And in that quiet act, the world remembers itself once more.
Opa.